I am grateful again to our partners and co-sponsors. I see Peter Buxbaum's face in front of me. I don't know if you all see him, but Peter and Mark Enshin and David Light are co-chairs of the J-Plan, Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and Ruach Chidush, and we have a number of the members of the executive committee and members of Ruach Chidush, which is Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, in the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, our co-sponsors and partners in so many of these pursuits. So thank you to our co-sponsors, and without further ado, Dan, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Uri, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Danny Ben David. I'm a macroeconomist at Tel Aviv University. I specialize in economic growth, in other words, long-run perspective of countries. And together with Professor Eyal Kimchi, a Hebrew University economist, he's a microeconomist specializing in labor economics. I'm at Tel Aviv University economy, specializing in growth. Together, we established a Shoresh institution a few years ago. Our director of strategic partnerships, Cynthia Roslowski, is with us here today as well. We created Shoresh because we fear for the future of Israel. There's no other way to put it. Israel has some of the best universities in the world, a phenomenal cutting-edge high-tech sector, and yet we are situated as a nation in our entirety, we're situated on long-term trajectories that are simply unsustainable. And we've been on these trajectories since the 70s, basically. They're very steady, and I'm going to show them to you in a moment. The sky won't fall in another year or two, nor either in a decade or two. But there does exist a democratic point of no return, beyond which laws that are very difficult to pass today are just going to become impossible to legislate in the future. This past year, the pandemic basically provided us with a wake-up call. While the crisis led to the evaporation of businesses and jobs, it also raised to the surface a host of very serious problems that we in Israel have been sweeping under the rug for years. Basically, long-standing political priorities, mismanagement, and their fatal implications were just laid bare for everyone to see, to understand, hopefully to internalize. Just a few days ago, what we saw at Mount Meron, the disaster there, was basically just another terrible example of the government's inability to plan, its very poor execution, and its abysmal enforcement. The caving into Haredi leadership was not just in Mount Meron, it was also during the pandemic. The share of Haredim that are above the age of 60 who died over the past year is 4 times the national share of persons who died over the age of 60. And while part of that has to do with the congested living condition, we looked at it we basically dissected it statistically, and the primary reason was basically issues that had to do with basically ignoring the rules and regulations that were set. So the disaster upon the Haredim was not just this past week, it was even much greater over the past year. Now, while every country has its challenges, some of Israel's root, which means Shoresh, and that's why we call the institution Shoresh Institution, only a few of these have existential implications. And most of the issues that I'm going to focus on today are not new, but they're rarely looked at together holistically, like in the format that I'm going to show you. And particularly speaking, they're not looked at within a long-term perspective, which I'd like to share with you today. The Shoresh objective is basically to shift the policymaking in Israel and the public discourse that affects it to the evidence-based underpinnings that emphasize the big picture, primarily where we were, where we are, where we're headed, what are the implications, And basically, what are the strategic issues that we need to deal with while we still can? So with that in mind, let me hook up to the screen here and we can get going. Let me just, so you'll excuse me if I look over to the side here, because that's where the screen with the graph is for me. The everything will be okay mindset, that was last week, even though, as you probably know, the title was before last week. That's Israel. Yeh Beseder is like the national motto, except it won't be Beseder. And we pay a huge price for that attitude. However, the fact that so many terrible things happened over the past year that we need to put together enables us to put them together in a potentially different manner. So that's what we try to do at Shoresh. Shoresh again means root. There are a lot of issues that need to be covered in Israel. We kind of drill down beneath the superficial, shallow public discourse to focus on the root causes that will determine if Israel will even be or not be. So when we look at the long term, one of the primary aspects of economic growth that we economists teach our students is the stability of the long run path. And just to give you a sense of how stable that is, let me focus on the US, just to, again, to show you how difficult it is to move a country from its long run path. So this is data from 1890. GDP per capita, that's the average amount produced per person. It's the common measure the economists use for standards of living. The trend line has a positive slope. In other words, incomes increased over time. And this is the actual growth path for the United States over the past 130 years. It's like a ruler. You can see here in the Great Depression, the US was for many years below trend. But in general, it's fluctuating. There are business cycles. The past decade has not been a particularly good one, as the US didn't completely recover from the major recession of just over a decade ago. But in general, that's the path. It looks like that for all developed countries. Very difficult to move a country from its path. Now Israel. We were also on a very steady path from 1950. Israel was born 1948. Most of our data was born 1950. So we start then. Very steady path. Despite what most Israelis think that economics doesn't apply to us, we're special, not that special. Here we were rationing food. We were so poor in the early 50s because we were collecting people with only the clothes on their backs and building towns and roads and rationing food. But we grew out of it, returned to normal. The slope of the path reflects the rate of economic growth. A year goes by, incomes rise. If they rise by a lot, you're going to get a very steep path. And this was an exceptionally steep path. We were growing very, very quickly. If you compare Israel to countries that were very similar to us in the early 50s, 4 countries immediately above and 4 countries immediately below Israel, you'll be able to see just how fast we grew compared to these countries. This is the annual growth rate per capita. And you can see that we are close to the top of these countries, growing very, very quickly. Had we continued along this path, it would have looked like the dotted blue line. But there's a reason why it's dotted, why it's blue, because that's not our path. What happened was this 1973 Yom Kippur War caused a major, major reset of our national priorities. The catalyst was the war. The reset of national priorities came afterwards, and this was our new path. And you don't need fancy statistics here to see how different it is. It's a much shallower path. In other words, we're growing much less quickly than before. And here too, if you compare Israel to countries that were similar to us this time in the early 70s, 4 above and 4 immediately below, we basically fell close to the bottom of the group. So that's how big a change we underwent here. If we narrow this down even further, instead of GDP per person, not everyone works. So GDP per hour worked is a lot more precise measure, which determines our wages and income eventually. And when we compare all of the countries in the OECD, all of the developed world countries are members of the OECD. Not all OECD countries are developed. So basically, all of the relevant countries have higher productivity than Israel. Even though we are the startup nation, we only produce, the average Israeli who works, this doesn't even include people who don't work, produces only $44 an hour compared to $72, $73 an hour in the States. But the problem is worse. It's not only low, when you narrow this down and compare Israel to the leading developed world countries, the G7, the US, Canada, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan, you can see that we've been falling further and further behind for the past 4.5 decades. And the average growth rate of GDP per hour of productivity is nearly a 0.5 percentage point per year greater than in Israel. So that's like compounded interest. That means that the gap has been growing steadily, and the gap between these countries and Israel is now more than 3 times what it was in the early 70s. That has huge ramifications for our ability to keep our most educated, our most skilled Israelis at home, because the bigger the gap between what you can get abroad and what you can earn in Israel, the more difficult it will be to keep these guys here. And just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, if we look at all of the Israelis who attained an academic degree over a 30-year period, 1980 to 2010, the Central Bureau of Statistics asked them, where are you? So some returned to Israel, some leave Israel. The insert here, the graph that's the insert here, shows that for every Israeli who returned, every Israeli with an academic degree who returned to Israel, 2.8 left in 2014. We're up to 4 who left for everyone who returned. The numbers are still small, relatively speaking, but they speak to a much bigger problem. We have a country that's falling further and further behind for 4.5 decades, and we don't have another 4 decades of this kind of graph, because what's happening here is basically 2 countries in one. There's the startup nation, Israel, and then there's all the rest. And the rest is big. The rest is not receiving either the tools or conditions to work in a modern economy, and their share in the total is growing. So it's like this huge weight that's pulling down an entire country, even though part of the country is phenomenal. It's first world, cutting edge, and so on. But think of an engine. You have all the cylinders of the engine, but we're only using fewer and fewer of the cylinders. And keep in mind, the cylinders that are working here don't have to remain in our engine. They can move to yours. So that's an untenable situation. If we try to drill down and understand what's underlying this, it has to do with the change in national priorities that Israel underwent in the 1970s. It's an infrastructure issue. It's the human capital infrastructure, schools, the quality of schools, universities, and so on, or higher education. And it's also the quality of our physical infrastructure. So I'm going to touch upon each of these in a moment, but let's start with probably the most important one, education. Because on the face of it, we are the people of the book. We are very educated. If you look at the share of, or the average number of years of schooling per prime working age Israeli, we're number 3 in the OECD, or number 3 in the world, basically. If we would look at a different graph, the number of people with an academic degree, we're number 2 in the world. So on paper, we're super educated. So what's the problem? The problem is that we're a nation of shortcuts. What counts is not the number of years of schooling, but the schooling in the number of years, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln. I'll show you here on this graph the relationship between education and growth. I'm going to start with education quantity, basically the number of years of schooling. That's what we're measuring on the horizontal axis. And economic growth, average rates of economic growth. 50 countries over a 40-year span, and you can see that there's not much of a relationship. It doesn't really matter how many years of schooling you have. But if we replace quantity with education quality, that's something that's measured every few years in international exams in core subjects, math, science, and reading. And here you can see where there's a very, very strong relationship. It really matters what you know, not how many years it took you to get there. And when we look at this in terms of what is the level in Israel, The most recent PISA exam, if we compare it to the developed world countries, this is our average and their average in math, science, and reading. Our children are at the bottom of the developed world. And keep in mind, this does not include a whole swath of Israelis, the Haredim. The Haredim don't even study. Most of them don't study the material. Therefore, they don't even take the exam. So we cannot blame them for this result. Had they taken the exam, it would be even worse. But we are the only country in the developed world that does not require our children to study a core curriculum. It's mandatory everywhere in the world, including the US. It's not mandatory here. Basically, we allow parents here, specifically Haredi parents, to deprive their children of a basic education. So if we put the Haredim aside for a second and look at the other three streams of education in Israel, the other two Jewish streams are the secular, the non-religious, and the religious. The secular stream has an okay education. Their average is above the majority of countries. The religious schools in Israel are not that good. They're below the vast majority of countries here. And the education that we give our Arab children, that's already below many third world countries. If we were to do a similar kind of exercise for the US, since we're all in the US in general, you can see the average here is nothing to write home about. But the US, like Israel, is a very polarized society. You have whites and blacks and Hispanics and Asians. And if we were to look at how well these different groups did on the same exam, you can see the Asians and the whites are way up at the top. In fact, the Asians are literally off the chart. That bar is off the chart. The 549 is written inside, but the Asians are off the chart. The whites in America are basically with an average like the top countries in the OECD, Japan and Korea. And then you have, going way down here, the Hispanics. The Hispanics are still doing better than Israel on average. And then blacks who do worse than Israel, but better than the Arabs in Israel. And the Arabs in Israel do better than the Haredim in Israel. So you get a glimpse here of how serious the situation is going forward. Now, if we take the Arab kids in Israel, forget third world countries, compare the Arab kids in Israel just to predominantly Muslim countries. There were 10 such countries that took this exam. Our kids did worse than 9 of the 10 countries, Muslim countries that took the exam. And if we look at the demographics here, in first grade this year, this is the breakup of the children. So between a fifth and a quarter of the children, 22% are Arab kids, with achievements on average below many, many third world countries. And then we have the Haredi children, over a fifth of the children in Israel. And most of them don't even study the material. Those two groups alone are almost half the kids. And then we have the periphery children, those in the geographic or social periphery. So roughly speaking, we're talking about half the kids in Israel today are receiving a third world education. And they belong to the fastest growing parts of the population. That's just untenable. They're not going to be able to support a first world economy when they grow up, only a third world economy. But a third world economy cannot support a first world healthcare system or welfare system. And it certainly cannot support a first world army, which in our neighborhood, we will need to survive. And we're going to have an existential issue here in several decades if we don't get our act together. If we look at taxes, Israel is skewed more than most developed countries toward indirect taxes, like sales taxes or customs or VAT, which are considered disproportionately regressive on the poor. Most developed world countries have moved more toward direct taxes. The key one here is the income tax, and that's the direction we're going to have to go as well. Already today, you can see that half the population pays no income tax. They are so poor, they don't reach the bottom rung of the income tax ladder. 92% of all the income tax collected in Israel comes from the top 2 income deciles. 20% of the population pay for 92% of all of our income tax. And that's something that's steadily creeping upwards because we're not including large segments of the population in the economy. We're not giving them the tools or conditions to work. Keep in mind here, I haven't even shown you anything about inequality or poverty. I'm on purpose focusing on the growth aspects because contrary to the public discourse, where most people think either I'm a bleeding heart liberal, all I care about is poverty and inequality, or I'm some greedy capitalist, all I care about is economic growth. It's not right. It's not that one or the other. The idea that it's one or the other comes from the very superficial argument that, okay, if I have poor, if I want to help them, I need to give them more money. If I give them more money, I need to raise taxes to pay for it. If I raise taxes, I inhibit the desire to work, to invest. That hurts growth. So it's either or. But if you drill down, what determines growth and what determines really inequality and income? If we give more people the skills and the ability to work in a modern economy, certainly that will help them personally and help in terms of poverty and inequality. But it's like adding more cylinders or starting to use more of the cylinders that already exist in our engine. We'll be able to grow faster. Now, one of the questions that many Israelis and others have is, are we becoming a more religious country or a more secular country? So I want to go into that for a second here, because I know that that's an issue that interests Chidush and others affiliated with Chidush. This is based on a pretty massive study done in Israel, asking people, first of all, to describe what they are, what they consider themselves, the Jews, in terms of 4 different classifications: Haredi, ultra-Orthodox; religious Jews; Masorti, traditional Jews; and secular, Chiloni. And it also asked these people, how did you grow up? What were you when you were 15 years old? So we can get an idea of the movement between the groups, okay? So if we look at Haredim, 88% of those who grew up as Haredim remained Haredim. They have a very, very high retention rate. Only 12% become less religious, and you can see the data here. 4% become religious, 5% become traditional, and 2% go all the way to the other end, become secular. So very, very low attrition here. The other group that manages to keep a very large share of those who grew up that way are the secular Jews. 84% of those who grew up secular remain secular. And the remainder become more religious along the lines you can see here, primarily Masorti, traditional. If we look at the traditional Jews, only 2/3, just over 2/3 remain Masorti, remain traditional, with nearly a quarter becoming Chiloni, becoming secular, and only a few, only 10% going in the other direction, becoming more religious, 6% becoming religious, 4% going to the other extreme, becoming Haredim. The group who is least able to maintain, to retain its children as adults in that group are the religious Jews. Only half of them, just over half, remain religious Jews. Only 6% become more religious. All the rest become less religious. 1/3 become traditional. 9% become secular. Those who become traditional, the next generation, you can see here, some of them become secular. So on the face of it, it would appear that Israel is becoming less and less religious over time. Not true. That's part of the problem that we have in the discussion in general of taking pieces of information and building entire stories about them, because we're ignoring a major piece here, which is fertility rates. If we look at fertility rates, you can see the vast difference between these groups. So while half of the religious remain, they're still going to have basically the same increase as the secular. The group here that's going to dominate eventually are going to be the Haredim. They retain, and they also have phenomenal growth rates, 7% growth rates. So that when we look at how fast Israel is changing, if we look at the share of Haredim in each generation, so we're going to look at it by birth years here. The older generation in Israel, those who are 75 to 79 years old, only 3% of that cohort is Haredim. If we assume that you have a new generation every 25 years, so the next group is 50 to 54 years old, 6% of them are Haredim, so it's double their share. Go another generation forward, 25, 29 years old, it's a further doubling to 13%. And the kids who were born in recent years, that's already almost a quarter of the children. So this is something that's happening very, very quickly. The bottom line is that when we look at the Central Bureau of Statistics forecast here, if the Haredim were only 7% of the adults, this is 6 years ago, they're 9%. It hasn't changed much. They're 7 or 8% of the adults today. They're 19, say 20% of the children, 0 to 14. But if we look just 2 generations ahead, okay, the grandchildren of these children here, what's the breakup going to be according to the middle forecast, not even the more extreme one? Welcome to Israel. This is the forecast for what Israel's going to look like. It's not going to look like that. I can pretty much guarantee it's not going to look like that. I don't know what it will look like. I can give you 2 alternative scenarios. One scenario is we get our act together and we fix the school system, reform it entirely for everyone, but not only everyone, that includes also the Haredim. And the moment you require a core curriculum and you upgrade it, so people basically are exposed to other possibilities, and middle class becomes a possibility when you grow up, it affects fertility rates. So we'll never look like this column on the left, but we won't look like this. Whatever will look like, at least it'll be a population that will be able to maintain a first world economy, without which we don't survive at that point. That's one scenario, but it's not the default scenario. The default scenario right now is we keep our heads in the sand, ignore everything that's going on around us, and keep arguing about the placement of deck chairs on the Titanic. And if that's the case, then good luck keeping 35% of these guys in Israel at that point. It's not going to happen. So we have a problem here going forward. One of the things that we see is that the Haredim are working more. They are going to college more. And so we, like in other spheres, we Israelis like to put a check mark on, problem solved, don't need to delve into it any deeper. Well, if we look at the number of Haredim in higher education, there is a pretty massive increase in the number of Haredim in higher education. Now, that's misleading in a number of ways. One is that there are more Haredim, so it's more accurate to look at it as a share of the population. But this is specifically, it's primarily women. The increase in Haredi men that go to higher education, there is an increase in absolute numbers, but it's not a big one. But that's not even the biggest issue. The primary problem is that the level of education that they receive is so bad that they don't make it all the way through, they drop out. Even though they're not going to the Technion or Hebrew University or Tel Aviv University, they're going to some really crummy colleges in general, most of them. And these are their dropout rates from the really crummy colleges. Even the women who were convinced receive a good education, over half drop out. And over 3/4 of the men drop out. They can't make it through. There are no shortcuts in life. If you don't reach these children when they're young and give them what they need, they're just simply unable. And these are the ones who want to get a higher education. They're unable to overcome some of these problems. I can tell you, as someone who teaches at Tel Aviv University in the graduate school, we admit some of the top Haredim that have good grades from wherever they got their undergraduate degrees. And then they reach me. I'm like the barrier to entry in the department, because I teach the introductory economics course. And this is a graduate course. They want to learn management. They need some basic economics, but they don't know English. So how are they going to read the text and the materials? They don't know basic math. So how are they going to solve equations? 2 equations, 2 unknowns is unknown to these guys. and you can really feel sorry for them. They have better study habits than most of our kids, but they start off at such a deficit that very few of them are able to overcome it, and that's just deplorable what's being done to them. So in general, instead of looking at how many go to higher education, how many actually get a degree, and has that changed as a percentage of the population? So if we focus on prime working age people in general, the benchmark here are the secular Jews have the highest rates of academic degrees, more for women than for men, very similar to the West, and rising. This is what it looks like for the Haredim. So for women, we do see an increase in recent years, number of women getting degrees. It's primarily from teaching colleges, but still it's an increase here, somewhat of an increase. For the men, nothing, absolutely nothing. Despite all the hype that they understand that they need to go to school, and more do understand that they need to go to school, they are unable to overcome what we inflict on them as children by depriving them of core education. To summarize this, if we compare Haredim in America to Haredim in Israel, what is the share with an academic degree? In America, they're not allowed to avoid a core curriculum, even though they try. They try to learn from our guys, but still, in general, it's more than double the share in Israel, even though it's low for America in general. It's double the share for Israel. So we're looking at something here that's a major problem that's developing, certainly not just the Haredim. And I want to focus on some of the bigger issues now. Something happened to us in the 1970s. We basically changed our national priorities, and we moved to these new long-run paths that are, especially over the past year, become much more readily apparent. So I'm going to kind of whiz through them just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about and how sharp of a turn this is. So if we look at healthcare, a big issue over the past year, of course, this is data from the birth of Israel, 1948. This very, very poor country with an ingathering of people with only the clothes on their backs, basically. Just a massive increase in the population, no food, had to build towns and roads. They also built hospitals. The share of hospital beds per capita remained relatively constant until the late 70s, 1977. And ever since then, even though we're much wealthier, this has been in a free fall. We are now with occupancy rates in the hospitals that are at the top end of the developed world. No other country has such crowded hospitals like Israel. This is all pre-COVID, but it gives you a sense here of why we had to shut everything down so quickly when the virus hit Israel. If we look at congestion on the roads, it's another aspect of the infrastructure. If I have a fleet of trucks and I have to move stuff from one point to the other, and my drivers and trucks are just sitting in traffic all the time, and I have to double the number of drivers and the number of trucks, their productivity just fell by half immediately. So the number of vehicles per kilometer road in Israel, we attained equality with the small European countries by 1970. But look what's happened since. Our congestion is nearly 3 times that of the small European countries, even though we don't have a lot of vehicles. We have 40% less vehicles per capita because they're really expensive. It's just that somebody forgot to invest in the transportation infrastructure, be it roads or alternative to roads. And one of the excuses that we give commonly is that we don't have enough money. We spend so much money on defense that there's not enough left for civilian purposes. So let's take a look at that for a moment. If we look at public expenditure relative to GDP and compare to the OECD, in 1960, we were roughly at the same spot point as the OECD. Then this just shot to the ceiling because we had the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, Lebanon War, and a host of other issues, Aliyah. Spending went through the ceiling. We had crazy inflation. And then Israel did what Israel does. When our back is to the wall, we get our act together. After doing everything wrong in the interim, we finally get our act together. That's what we did here. We got control over the budget. We brought it down basically to OECD levels. The OECD in the past decade isn't where it used to be because it hasn't emerged, just like the US, it hasn't yet emerged from that recession of about a decade ago. But this includes defense. It still doesn't answer, did we have enough money to pay for civilian purposes? So now let's remove the defense expenditures. That leaves us with only civilian public expenditures. This is money going only for civilian purposes. We remove it in Israel, we remove it in the OECD. It's lower in recent years, but look at all of these decades. When we pivoted away from the issues that are of national interest, we had more than enough money. We just stopped giving it to the areas that matter to all of us, and it started going to sectors that had extensive political power, basically, or personal interests, but it stopped going to serve the national interest, and that's what happened. Now, one of the areas when we talk about paying for COVID, for example, or for a lot of the issues that we need to start dealing with, we have this like knee-jerk reaction. Okay, raise taxes and cut the budget for everybody. Well, in Israel, there's another source which we like to ignore because it's an area we enforce the laws, which we're not really good at, and it's called the shadow economy. A shadow economy, just so for those who are unfamiliar with the term, it's not activity that's illegal. It's completely legal activity, it's just not reported. I don't report my income, I don't report transactions, and so these are not reported, not taxed. And the size of Israel's shadow economy is nearly 1/5 of GDP. If we were to reduce our shadow economy to the size of, say, France, Germany, US, and so on, how much money would that give us? So that's what this graph is for. If we were to reduce our shadow economy to the size of the French, 11.7%, 12%, in other words, from 19 to 12%, we would get an additional 100 billion, 106 billion shekels added to GDP. If we reduce it to Canadian levels, German or US levels, we'd be adding another 137, 170, almost 200 billion shekels to the economy. In general, the value of this is nearly 300 billion shekels. That's not going to taxes. Only about 1/3 of that, 35%, is going to taxes. So our tax increase would be 37, 48, up to 60 billion shekels. Now, that may not mean much to you because you live in dollars. It actually doesn't mean much to Israelis because none of us really live in terms of billions of shekels. So let me give you an idea of what these numbers actually mean. Government expenditures on healthcare in Israel, 34 billion shekels. Our entire expenditure on primary and secondary education, 26 billion shekel. The entire higher education budget is 11 billion shekel. I mean, this is just a transformative issue if we just enforce the laws. But there are groups here that don't really want to be enforced. And that leads to the issues that we have here. So the idea is not to make everyone despondent that the future is already going to be the end of us. If I thought so, I wouldn't live in Israel. Okay, I think that we do have a chance, and in recent years, I've been ending the talks with a quote by Aviv from the days that we still had good foreign ministers, who said, "Many nations behave wisely once they've exhausted all other alternatives." He knew what he was talking about. That's us, literally. That was during COVID. That's in everything that we do. We do everything wrong until our back is to the wall, and then we get it right. And we have a lot of things going for us if we just get our act together while we still have a chance. Because it's really a golden period here that we have. We have some of the best universities in the world. This is a study done by Uwe Kirsch from the Technion, who looked at the fields that you see here and ranked all of the countries in the world according to academic excellence. Academic excellence in this case is the number of citations on average per academic article in each of these fields. Where do we rank? And you can see that even with the brain drain, we still have a critical mass here that's pretty good. So the knowledge is here. We invest huge amounts in R&D, and that yields to quite a few patents, international patents, by Israelis relative to country size. We were once below the leading developed world countries. We've surpassed them a quarter century ago and remained above. And so during this like golden period that we're living in, this is the place to invest. We see it in foreign direct investment, venture capital investment, which I'm going to show you here, relative to GDP. And you can see that we in the US are just off the charts. Basically, you have to shrink the entire graph to get us in. This is not going to our rich uncle elsewhere and asking, begging for, you know, for money to keep us going. These are serious people investing here because this is the place to invest. So if we were to put the two Israels and one concept into one graph, it would be this one. If we look at all the countries in the world with at least 1 million people, with a population of at least 1 million people, and data for fertility rates and also standards of living, GDP per capita, and rank or group them according to income levels. So all the countries with at least $40,000 per person income, the high income countries, you can see that there are very big income gaps between these countries. They're not a homogeneous group. They have relatively small families. In fact, in some cases too small. That creates problems in and of itself. The next group is a group between $20,000 and $40,000. And by definition, it's below the top group. Here, however, we have a few countries that have substantially higher growth, fertility rates. However, and it's a big however, by far the largest group of countries in the world are the very, very poor countries. They have about 4 times the number of countries in that group as in each of the other groups. And you can see that how they're arrayed here. And in general, very high fertility rates. So where's Israel, you may ask? Here's Israel. We haven't yet decided who we belong to. This is not an equilibrium position. We are basically at the bottom of the developed world with a large number of kids. Now, the US, that's up here. If we drive a line from the US through Israel, we reach Burundi. Burundi is the poorest country here on the graph. Israel is sort of a weighted average between a first world country and a third world country. We have both first world and third world in one country. And we have to decide which one is going to win out because there is no other country where we're located. We have to move, apparently, going to have to belong to one of these groups. Our default right now is going to be downwards given the demographics that you saw and our inability or unwillingness to include these population groups in the part of a modern economy and modern society. But that doesn't have to be the case. So to give you a sense here of what we're looking at, what we try to do at Shoresh is to highlight these issues to as many people as possible. We are, if we focus on, excuse me, that graph moved out of position, so let me move it back. If we focus on the primary issues here, of all the things that I showed you, we have an opportunity. We had a major calamity here, the major crisis. Things are going to have to be fixed. And if we fix it with an eye on the long term, what are the things, the primary issues that we need to focus on? Core problem, or Shoresh problem number 1, is the education system. It's in need of a massive reform. Basically, unless we change it, our kids, this is how we prepare our kids for the future. And this is how the other countries are preparing their kids to basically compete with each other. That's unsustainable. That's problem number 1, needs to be dealt with tomorrow morning. Problem number 2, or issue number 2, is the rapidly changing demographics. Basically, what I told you earlier, about half the kids here are receiving a third world education. They belong to the fastest growing parts of the population. And we are the only country not requiring all of our children to study at least the basics that would give them a lease on life as adults. That's got to change. And the third issue is the issue of enforcing our laws, enforcing our regulations. Har Meron, the Mount Meron catastrophe, that was something that was written on the wall for decades. People have been saying, you need to fix it, saying how to fix it. There have been government commissions on that, and yet we do nothing. We regulate and we have laws and we just ignore them. During the corona, we tried to implement a system where only the towns that are hardest hit would be shut down so that the rest of the country would remain open. But that failed because of political pressure. We wanted to shut down schools only in these areas, but of course, or we ended up shutting down the entire system. However, only the non-Haredi schools shut down, the Haredim businesses open. So we have a major problem of enforcing laws, and it comes into play in a whole host of issues. Among them is just collecting taxes. That's doable. We just need to get our act together on this. So one of the things that we try to do at Shoresh is to bring this to the attention of the leading policymakers. Just to give you a sense here of what I'm talking about. We did a study a few years. I'm sorry. We did a study a few years ago on math. Does studying math at the high level affect your income down the road? It was a pilot study, but it'll give you a sense of how such policy research can make a difference. The reason we focused on math is you can see there was a free fall here. 12th graders studying math at 5 units, which is the highest level in Israel, fell by a third within just a few years. And so we did the study and we met with the then education minister, Naftali Bennett, and showed him, among other things, the following graph. The graph will show you basically what were the grades of children in high school and what were their wages 12 years later. So kids who were flunking at 5 units were earning hourly wages basically roughly at the level of kids who were excelling at 4 units. Kids who were flunking or barely passing at 4 units were earning like the kids who were excelling at 3 units. Now, why is that important? Because up to that point, everyone in Israel was telling the children to dumb down. The parents are saying, if you're having a tough time at 5 units, go to 4 and be a big fish in a small pond. The schools were competing with each other, want to show a high average grade. So if they have a weak child, they kind of force them to go to a lower level so that they can have higher averages, which is why you have this free fall here in the share of children studying math. So when we showed this to Bennett, the education minister, he stopped us when we reached this graph, and he told his assistant, start taking pictures, and basically created a video of him explaining this graph to the parents, to the teachers, to the principals, went on a nationwide campaign, enlisted then President Perez. We showed up as well. We were interviewed on this. And this is what happened. You can change things at the national level if there is if it's focused on some facts and details. You can convince people. Of course, the message to Bennett wasn't the math. It was reform the entire system and impose a core curriculum, which of course he didn't do. He focused on the math, but at least he did that. But we meet, the whole point here is to be apolitical, to meet with right-wing, left-wing, religious, non-religious. This is Stav Shafir. She's a left-wing politician. She's now out of the Knesset, but at the time she was in the Knesset. This is in my office. She's showing her followers the material. The idea is to get as many people as possible to understand the long term, because that's not a part of the discourse in Israel or elsewhere among people who care about Israel. Meeting with the blue-white leaders. This is with Ashkenazi, with Gantz, with Lapid. Okay, we just take the stuff and we meet with them and we show them. Lapid, for example, took our material, and these are graphs that I showed you. Some of them I showed you, some I didn't show you. And he did like a TED talk, a half-hour talk on this material. So the idea is to try and bring this to the policymakers, have them understand it, bring it to the public so that they'll understand. This is with Lieberman, and briefing him, briefing his entire Knesset contingent, and so on. But the point is, get them to understand these issues. So if this interests you and you think that people should know, those three graphs that I showed you, the three core issues, they're at the top of the website. You can see the website here. Share them with people. Anyone who cares about Israel, show them what are the main problems, show them additional material. But we would be very happy if you helped us basically get the message out. We're in a race against time, basically. We have a situation that can be changed, I believe, in the near future, but that's not something that's going to hold forever. We have a limited window of opportunity, and it's on us to fix it. So I will stop here, and if there are any questions, comments, feel free.
All right. Thank you, Dan. I think that no one on this webinar will doubt or think that I exaggerated when I introduced you saying this is a very different webinar than many others we've held. You have provided us not just food for thought, but hardcore data that I dare say many people in leadership positions who are regularly connected and interact with Israel are aware of that. And therefore, I think that our participants will be interested in sharing the recording of this video. We'll talk about whether you can make the PowerPoint presentation available to them, and I urge you to consider supporting the work of Professor Dan Ben David and getting the information from them. Occasionally we send it out to you, and we'll follow up and keep you informed to the best of our ability of the tremendous work that Dan and his team are engaged in. So we got a few questions already. Rabbi Jordan Milstein asks, how are you able to measure economic productivity and GDP effectively if so much of the economy is shadow economy?
That's an excellent question. So we're not measuring it effectively. We're missing about a fifth of GDP. So clearly, it should be higher. It should be higher for all countries, but even more so in the case of Israel, which has a massive deficit in that regard. But having said that, let me do the share screen again for a second and show you. Having said that, if we go to where is it? The labor productivity slide, basically, even if our graph should be higher, we're still falling further and further behind. I mean, I think there's not really a case here for saying a greater share of Israelis are cheaters. We have a certain share that are cheaters, and so the whole graph, the whole red curve should be higher, but it's still with a much slower slope, which means that the problem is still the same problem. Even if we're not as poor as we seem to be, the problems that we're talking about are still the same problems here. And so that is unaffected here.
Now, I want to stress something that is connected to the next question. Often people relate to the challenge of religion and state in Israel in a sentimental mode, and don't realize that the challenges of the unholy alliance of religion and politics in Israel impact on not just pluralism, the rights of non-Orthodox, religious freedom in general, etc., but on the very core issues of Israel's ability to make the most of its resources, to enter into the world as a leading economy and a leading developed country. And Dan really provides us with crucial information to understand that the challenge of religious freedom and equality is all-encompassing in terms of Israel's future and the future of its relationship with you, with world Jewry. So Neil Gold, Rabbi Neil Gold, a member of our executive committee of Ruach Hidush, is asking, is there any indication that there are leaders in the Haredi communities who see this writing on the wall and are working towards solutions? Who are they and what are they doing?
I think the changes that we see are more at the grassroots. The problem is really, to be honest, I think it's less with the Haredi community and more with the Haredi leadership in general, in the sense that you could see, for example, more and more Haredim go to higher education. There is an understanding that they need different tools, but we enable their leaders basically to coerce in such a, first of all, I think there's no other word other than brainwash the children. They study no science, no English, rudimentary math. They have very little ability to get facts outside of what they're being told are the facts. And so they have very little ability to go outside of that. While there are increasing numbers who I think want to, and with the evolution of the smartphone, even though the leadership forces them to have what are called kosher servers, which is a bad use of the word kosher, I think, because it's basically like communist China, basically depriving them of access to different websites. An apparently high number of Haredim, especially the younger Haredim, have two phones, so that they are able to circumvent their leadership and get access to the outside world. The problem is that we, the non-Haredim, enable their leadership to have this crushing effect on their ability to leave, because if somebody leaves, his whole family is stigmatized. The social pressures here are immense, and unless we do something, and here too we have this once in an era opportunity here, ostensibly after this past election, which was seemingly for Bibi, anti-Bibi, but basically what you have is the ability on the one hand to put together a coalition that would be unheard of in any other situation, which puts aside right-wing versus left-wing, religious versus secular, Arab versus Jew, all of them together. That's an opportunity. That's a huge opportunity. Keep out the Haredi. Let me show you something about how strong the Haredi power is and what kind of a stranglehold they have on us. Let me hook this up again. If we look at the elections, this is last year. I haven't done the data for this one, but we tend to look at election outcomes during certain visors, which are a little bit outdated. In other words, voter turnout. So voter turnout, if we look in Israel, Haredi has very high, they have very high voter turnout. 78% of the eligible voters go out and vote. 66% of the Arabs went out and voted. Again, this is a year ago. This is after a series of elections where Netanyahu basically berated the Arabs, and they went out and voted. So this election, he did the opposite. He embraced them, and it went down. But that's the usual way of looking at it. And this is a voter turnout for the rest. However, there's a different way of looking at it, which is illuminating in terms of how much power the groups have and where is this heading over time, in light of your question, Louis. So instead of voter turnout, how many votes do the various parties receive from each of the groups? In other words, the Haredi parties received a whole bunch of votes. What percentage of those, what percentage are those votes of the total number of Haredim that are 18 up and up? In other words, voting age. And you can see that the number of votes that the Haredi parties received is excessively large. It's 33% more than all of the Haredim in Israel that are 18 and up, or all of the voting age Haredim. In other words, this isn't an issue of vote early, vote often. This is a lot of people who are not Haredim that are voting for Haredi parties. The opposite is occurring for the Arabs. Their turnout was 66%, but some of the Haredim didn't vote for Arab parties, they voted for other parties. And this is the breakup for the center left right and religious. So those are like the 4 blocks. But how have these blocks evolved over time? Well, this is every single election in Israel except the most recent one, which I still need to do on here. And I'm looking at it through today's visors, the 4 blocks that we have today: center left, right religious, Haredi, and Arab. So in the first elections up to the Yom Kippur War, the center left had about 50% of the total votes. The right-wing and religious parties had less. That's a bit misleading because Mafdal, which was the religious party, belongs to that group today, but they went with Labor in the past. So actually the center left had more at the time. Then came the Yom Kippur War, complete equality between these 2 groups, okay? Except that the Mafdal went with Labor, so Rabin was prime minister. This was the last time Labor was in government for a few decades. This is the Arab and Haredi parties, the total number of votes that they received out of the total votes cast, okay? Then, after 73, you have a continuing decline, except for a one-off, this is Kadima, but in general, a decline in the number of votes that the center and the left in Israel get out of the total. That's not surprising, most people know that. What I found surprising was the assumption is that the right-wing and religious, while the left and center is falling, right-wing and religious rise. That's not the case. They peaked at the first election, when Begin was elected the first time in 77, and they've been falling over time. The past few years have been for or anti-Netanyahu, so they've been kind of outliers. But if you overlay one on the other, basically both blocks are falling over time in their share of the total. Neither one has enough to have a majority to rule. So how do they rule? That has to do with what's going on down here. The Haredi parties, who were never a part of any coalition in Israel until 1977, have been in every single coalition. And out of the 44 years, they've been in every coalition except for 3 out of the 44 years. And so they've become the kingmakers. And when they join with the right wing and religious, that puts them over the top. So what happened here until this current election, which we still don't know how it's going to end up, they've been the kingmakers. Right wing to not work with the left takes the Haredim. Left to not work with the right takes the Haredim. And so they've had this very, very strong stranglehold, basically, on the political system, which enabled them to deprive their children of a good education. It meant that tons of money are going in that direction. We don't know how much because we don't have transparency of the budget. But we do know that significant amounts were going in that direction. And that has had a major impact on what's been happening in Israel over these decades.
Well, again, the additional data is sobering. I just want to, mention Chidush's role in all of that, namely, you put the emphasis on education, and I can tell our participants that currently we have a petition in court against the Ministry of Education and the Jerusalem municipality, because in addition to the schools that you alluded to, in Jerusalem alone, there are 20,000 ultra-Orthodox Haredi children in schools that are not even licensed in terms of safety, in terms of facilities. Totally under the radar. Neither the Ministry of Education nor the Jerusalem municipality, who have a legal obligation to enforce the law and close down every school that's not licensed, are not doing anything about it. And similarly, you rightly pointed out the critical importance of those standardized testing, because without the standardized testing, they claim that everything is fine and rosy. But they avoid participating in the standardized testing, which they cannot do because, unlike in the US, those schools, most of the ultra-Orthodox schools, are state-funded. And I think it's very important for our participants to understand that. In Israel, unlike the US, Ultra-Orthodox schools that do not teach core curriculum are obligated to teach core curriculum, but they still don't, are funded by the state. Most of them are 100% funded by the state. And one of the other areas that we are processing legally is the issue of participation in standardized testing. I won't relate any, any further now to the Chidush work, but let's end with one more question that was posted, actually two. One is, could you please define the difference between religious and traditional Jews in Israel? Does it have to do with ethnicities, Haredim versus Ashkenazim, Edot HaMizrach? Then the other question is, are there social service non-profits that help Haredim who want to leave their communities, such as give them housing, education, and necessary skills to search for jobs? Are they having any positive impact? Please name such organizations so that we might consider donations.
With regard to such organizations, there are such organizations in Israel. I honestly don't know their names, though you probably know better.
Well, let me then mention the names. The two leading organizations are Hillel and Yotzim L'Shinui. These are two organizations that offer basic support to people who leave the fold. We don't have the time to go into the details, but one of the key elements is that they are hardly supported by the state. There is plenty support to keep people in the fold. There is hardly any support for people who basically are thrown out of their families, do not have the education, do not have the skills, and find themselves out. And the state does not really provide any significant support to provide them with those services.
With regard to the question about what's the difference between the Haredim and, I'm sorry, between the religious and the Masortim, the traditional, it's very iffy. I mean, these are all self-identification, and it's not really four groups. It's a very continuous spectrum here of the degree of religiosity. When we talk about secular Jews, they're not necessarily atheists or non-religious. They also have various aspects of religion to this extent or that extent. But I wouldn't go quite so far as to make the distinction. Masorti, for example, they can go. They don't have to go. They can go to synagogue on Shabbat. I can give you an example of my wife's father. He was a cantor, but then he would come home and turn on the radio and turn on the light. Okay, he didn't have a problem with that. That's in the fold of what we call traditional. Although again, it's a highly flexible thing. I'm very hesitant to talk in terms of Ashkenazi and Mizrahi or Sfaradi because while those concepts were an issue decades ago, and many of our politicians still try to make hay out of it, let me give you an example from my own family. My mom was born in Iraq, my father in Lithuania, my kids in Chicago. I was born in Israel. My wife was born in Iran. I have a daughter-in-law with parents. One is Moroccan and the other one is Polish. We married each other. And education is the key here. So it's very difficult to describe us in one category. I don't know what I am. I'm Israeli. I'm Jewish. That's the only thing that really matters. And the politicians that try to make an issue of how the Mizrahim were deprived, they were deprived. My family, part of my family was sprayed with DDT when they came to Israel, as was my wife when she came here as an infant. So what? Okay, that was then. The key here is education, education, education. My wife grew up in Beit She'an, and then in one of the slums in Rishon LeZion called Shikun HaMizrach. But her mom made sure that her father passed away. Her mom did all kinds of odd jobs to make sure that she would finish school go to university. That's where we met. And that's what makes the difference. And my mother never finished high school either, but she sat on my head and made sure that I would go to school instead of play basketball like I wanted, but I wasn't good enough anyways. In any event, the whole point is that education brings us together. The issues of Sfaradim and Ashkenazim is primarily for the politicians and for all the, basically, I think, racists and demagogues that keep wanting to make this issue alive. We're way beyond that. And if you want to really close the gaps, give everybody a good education and see how we all marry each other. And that's the end of it. We all become one Israeli Jewish family.
Thank you, Dan. There is a comment here which I couldn't agree more with. I don't know if you saw it, but it's worth repeating.
Mm-hmm.
So please bring back Dan Ben David, such a cogent and easy to understand presentation, and need more questions and answers. So we'll send you with a follow-up, a paragraph from Shoresh with the contact email. And by all means, consider bringing Professor Dan Ben David to your organization, to your community, to your federation. It's so important that these facts that you don't hear from the diplomatic representatives of Israel in your communities. You don't hear the Prime Minister and down sharing with you. This is the key to keeping Israel strong and vibrant as it should be. And it's wonderful, Dan, to have you, and we'll keep bringing you, sharing your materials. And a reminder, May 20th, Thursday, would Ruth have been converted in Israel today if she tried to, with a great panel of three experts.
What time?
And in the meantime, Toda Rabba, again,
I
and
just
Shalom.
have one comment here for those of you who are interested. Everything I showed you is on the Shoresh website, shoresh.institute. And a lot more. It's way, way more than what I showed you here in the form of papers, policy papers, but even graphs. We have hundreds of graphs in a graph gallery on the website. So look at it, share it with people. And if the 3 points, the 3 main issues as separate graphs, take them off the website, share them with as many people you can. That's the only way that we can get people on board to understand what are the primary issues that Israel's facing. Thank you very much.
What time of day?
Pardon me?
The next.
Yes, webinar.
What time of day?
It's the same, noon, New York.
Thank you.
Very well. So, Toda, Professor Dan Ben David, thank you all for joining us until the next time in 2 weeks. And on behalf of Ruach Hidush, J-Plan, and the Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, Shalom and Laila Tov here from Jerusalem. Shalom, shalom.
תודה רבה. מעניין מאוד. הרצאה חשובה מאוד. יישר כוחך.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
Take care. Bye-bye.